Hello, welcome everyone. This is the third Climate and Health Forum on extreme climatic extremes and the impacts of these on human health. My name's Jo Miller and I'm the Global Health Facilitator at the University of Oxford, and I work pan-divisionally to facilitate global health research on many different areas, including climate and health. The purpose of today's forum is to support researchers from all divisions working at the intersection of climate and health research to come and talk together, discuss shared research interests, and maybe develop a common language for delivering interdisciplinary funding applications. We have people here from many different departments and divisions. There are people from our overseas units in Kenya, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. There are people from plant sciences, engineering sciences, physics, the business school, Department of International Development, School of Geography and the Environment, as well as surgery, primary care sciences, rheumatology, and many other parts of the university. So it's a really lovely mixture of people from different disciplines. If there are any technical questions, please contact Tristram or myself via AirMeet messages, or AirMeet have a 24/7 help button, which is a little purple yellow circle in the bottom right-hand corner with the question mark. And I want to let you know that the panelist session is being recorded, but not the breakout room discussions. And the recordings will be shared with attendees after the session. In the breakout room discussions, we have a rapporteur recording some of the key discussion points, and they're going to report back when we come together at the end. So I'm just now going to pass over to Neven Fuchka, one of the co-chairs, and he's going to tell you a little bit more. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Jo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. So I'm Neven Fuchka. I'm Mary Skłodowska-Curie Individual Fellow and COP26 Climate Risk Fellow, and I'm co-chairing this forum and with Professor Jim Hall. He's a professor of climate and environmental risk in a School of Geography and Environment, and he's also convener of the Oxford Networks for Environments one. These are 5 networks covering climate, energy, water, food, and biodiversity from a multidisciplinary perspective. And one of the key aspects that we want to cover in this forum is exploring different connections between climate and health, because this is one of the critical area of interest that offers plenty of opportunity for research in a multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approach. Basic idea is to explore the questions that are ready to be answered and ready to be, dealt with at this point, and form the interesting multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects that can be proposed to founders. For example, one of the interesting founders is Wellcome Trust, which has one of the 4 mainstream of interest is climate and health. Specifically, today we're going to talk about climatic extremes or environmental extremes, and we're going to explore the impacts of the extremes, which are, in a sense, the change of extremes is the sharp edge of climate change, the tails of distribution that inflict the most damage to the society. We're going to explore their impacts in different dimensions, from social dimensions to the physical aspects of the system. So, for example, for the start, we're going to cover the aspects of urbanization and immigration under the changing extreme events. So now let's turn to the Professor Miles Allen.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Those that have made it in, no, it's a really great initiative from Neven, and thank you very much, Neven, for convening this to get us talking, particularly within Oxford, about the whole climate and health nexus. I think Neven was talking about weather extremes in particular, and the sort of the health impacts of climate. I think it's also to think about the climate impacts of health, which may seem slightly more, slightly less obvious. But I noticed John Ingram's on the call, and the choices we make regarding our diet and health over the next 30 years are going to have a big impact on our climate that we're dealing with in the next second half of this century. So we need to think about these things together. Mitigation in particular, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, has to go hand in hand with improved health outcomes for the world. And some of the mitigation options we have, as soon as you start talking about electrifying home heating, somebody, and probing journalist immediately says, well, what about the pensioner who's going to have to spend more on putting in a home heating pump and so on? And won't this mean that people, as soon as you quote statistics like the fact that we heat our homes to be much warmer than they were 30 years ago, people immediately jump on that to say, yeah, but people died of cold in the winter 30 years ago, so clearly we don't want that to happen again. But I think there's a really interesting health issues around the way we live, not just the diet which people tend to focus on, but also the transport choices we make and the way we heat our homes as well have implications for health, which we've been discovering, of course, quite graphically over the past couple of years. So I just sort of picking up on Nevin's points about the importance of weather extremes. It's an area which Oxford has actually done huge amounts of work on, sort of quantifying the link, which Nevin and among others, quantifying the link between human influence on climate and extreme weather. It's something we're going to have to understand. I was just reverting to that. When I first got into this area in the 2000s, there was a very widely quoted WHO statistic of climate change kills 300,000 people a year, which nobody ever quite was sure where it came from. But understanding the impacts of climate change on human lives and livelihoods is going to be a big challenge for us over the next 30 years, particularly as the loss and damage agenda rises up. The UNFCCC priorities. Obviously the ultimate loss and damage is when people die, and that's one of the most contentious and contested issues in climate over the next 30 years will be this question of, do greenhouse gases kill? And there's a glib answer to that, and there are much more careful answers, and we need to make sure that we end up on the careful side of that dichotomy.
Thank you, Miles, for these important points. And next to Professor John Ingram. Professor Ingram will talk about impacts of extreme events on agriculture and food system. And let me introduce him briefly. He's associate professor and the leader of Environmental Change Institute food program. Trained in soil science, John Ingram gained extensive experience working in Africa and Asia in agriculture and forestry research projects. John's interests are in conceptual framing of the food systems, the interaction among many actors involved and their varied activities, and the outcome of their activities for food security, livelihood, and environment. He is coordinating the UK Global Food Security Programme, Resilience of the UK Food System in the Global Context Research Programme, developing and promoting ECI Food System Research Programme, and he's leading the multi-university Innovative Food System Teaching and Learning Programme. John, stage is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. Let me share a screen. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. Climate extremes impacting food security. Obviously, we're interested in climate change and extreme weather in this conversation, but it's important to remember that there are many other factors that will affect food security, and it's the interaction of these shocks and stresses which is really what we're having to deal with. But anyway, on to the main thrust. Climate change per se has been very well researched, and every year there's more and more detailed analyses. You see on the left a low emission scenario, and on the right a high emission scenario. And the blue is areas where it's what they call the safe climatic space for food crop production by the end of this century. Now, that's by the end of the century. Of course, technologies will change. This is all assuming current technologies, but it's an ominous picture as we go forward. But bringing it back to extreme weather events, we're very familiar with these sorts of images on our international press today. But just to bring it back to where we're speaking from in England, last 2018, we actually had a really bad harvest. And you see that the average yields dropped below 8 tons a hectare for the first time in 5 years due to the bad weather. And what we also saw is grass growth was seriously affected. So just to make a point that while a lot of the concern, of course, is in the developing world, and rightly so, there are issues here in the UK. We can have torrential rain producing massive lodging on this cereal crop. We can have a major flood affecting not only harvesting of whatever it is, but also trafficability for planting in next season's crop. And one can have a major event such as this, which required the army to come in and help with sandbags to stop a large area of Lincolnshire being flooded. So point made, I hope. There are issues all over the world to do with extreme weather. This was an image to do with how extreme weather actually affects distribution systems. Some of you may remember this incident down in the southwest of Britain several years ago. It didn't actually affect food security because there was all sorts of alternatives. The road network was very robust. Whereas here's a very similar picture in Bangladesh, where this is one of the main trunk lines which would deliver rice from the rice growing south up to the north. And of course, the people waiting at the north were not able to have access to food. There was a physical problem. It wasn't anything to do with agriculture. It was to do with infrastructure. Some years ago in Australia, there was a major flood in Brisbane. And because the supermarket system was working on a just-in-time basis, the infrastructure and the chaos in the city actually meant that the supermarket shops shelves were empty within a very short period of time, and it took many days to re-equip. But think about storage. This is an image, food storage in Haryana. This rice was in what's called a go-down, which was set aside for distribution in times of emergency. You can see the problem. A slightly different part of the world. Here we are in the Midwest, and this was extreme weather in the form of extreme wind, which completely smashed up this grain silo. So different parts of the world are affected from an infrastructure point in different ways. And then, of course, we've got food safety, which has a direct effect on health. You can look through the slide yourself, but essentially the fact that in extra damp weather, one might be using more pesticides to control a fungal outbreak or an insect disease. Mycotoxins build up. Many of you will be familiar with aflatoxin, particularly notable in maize and groundnuts, of course, but can affect all sorts of things. Marine biotoxins, harmful blooms, these red blooms themselves aren't a problem to us until we start eating the animals that eat that material, the filter feeders, the mussels and the oysters and the like, and then we can have some very serious food poisoning. And of course, just food going off quicker in hot weather and pathogenic bacteria building up. So there's a whole range of issues around food safety. But perhaps the most important thing for most people's food security in the world is the effect on the commodity price. Now, here's just one of the many graphs you could see. This was what was going on over the period 2015 through 2020 for the wheat price. And as you can see, it goes up and down. A lot of this is to do with weather. There are other factors, but weather is not insignificant. Does it matter? Well, here we have, again, a piece from the UK, an alarmist headline. Bread price may rise. It's set to, did it rise? Maybe it rose a little bit, but did it affect our shopping basket? Not a lot. So depends what the situation is. And I take the point that weather-induced price spikes affect affordability around the world, and that poor people spend relatively more of their income on food. And this graph is of distribution showing the percentage of disposable income spent on food on the y-axis and a log scale of per capita income on the x. And you can see there's a slope, and this lady doing the dhobi in Bangladesh up at the top of the slide is spending a very large proportion of a relatively small amount of money on food. Now, why does this matter? Going back to the UK, the cost of wheat in the actual cost of a loaf of bread in the UK is less than 10%. But it's 90% of the cost in the Japati. And this is to do with the way that the food system is operating, and particularly the number of activities and actions and enterprises that are involved between when the wheat comes off the farm and when it arrives in a loaf of bread in our shop or a Japati in a shop. So depending on where you are, the effect of extreme weather in relation to basic food price can be very serious. And with that goes a challenge for the politics, and this is really I think a very clear situation, showing where over the major price spikes in 2008 and 2012, there were well recorded food riots, bread riots. One might argue that the bread riots in Tunisia were very largely related to the cause of the launch of the Arab Spring. So, just to conclude, there are a large number of issues that we need to think about in terms of extreme weather. And what we are seeing is, sorry, I'm just trying to close this thing down so I get back to you. Am I back with you? Yeah.
Yes, you are.
So a lot of things when you think about extreme weather does affect agriculture and fisheries, obviously, but let's not forget that it affects lots of other things in the food sector, which ultimately relate to bring a bearing on our overall food security. So let me close there.
All right. Thank you, John. Now we're going to turn to the Dr. Giulio Boccaletti. He's going to lead the discussion on impacts of extreme events on water resources usage and sanitation. Giulio is a research associate at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, where he pursues the research on a broad set of issues from the economics of sustainability to the role of history in decision making. He has a PhD from Princeton University, and he worked also at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but then he left academia and joined McKinsey & Company, where he eventually became a partner. He was one of the leaders of the firm's sustainability and resource productivity practice and a co-founder of its water practice. In 2013, he joined the Nature Conservancy, the largest environmental conservation organization in the world, overseeing its water program across 35 countries. He became the TNC Chief Strategy Officer. In that capacity, he led the performance transformation of the institution and was in charge of 4,000 people with about $1 billion per year of measurable outcomes. He left the TNC last year to dedicate his time to a number of projects and advisory work. And his first book, Water, a biography, was just published last month. Giulio?
Thank you, Nevin, for the excellent plug to my book, which I hope people will read. Well, thank you for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think it's a really great opportunity to have a cross-disciplinary conversation. It's one of the reasons I try to attach myself to the Smith School is in the hopes of exchanging ideas with others. So I really welcome this opportunity. Let me just frame how I think about the problem of water. It's just one way of many. Water, as I think John said earlier, and Miles did also alluded to earlier, water is an agent on the landscape on behalf of the climate system. The climate system expresses itself through water, through floods and droughts and storms. It does in fact work, physical work on the landscape, and has a sort of distribution. And the modernist dream of the 20th century was essentially in that context to deliver absolute water security. It's a very strange dream, unusual in human history. For most of our history, acceptance and adaptation were far more common. But in the 20th century, we ended up with places like California, where you can be in a completely arid landscape, but a combination of sophisticated agronomy and vast infrastructure that collects about 4,000 cubic meters of water per capita ensures that you can live there as if you were in my hometown of Bologna, Italy, or anywhere else. And one of the things that's happening with the change in the tail distribution of events, the sort of extreme events that we're talking about today, is that the institutions and infrastructure that were put in place to deliver that modernist project are starting to fail. There's a number of interesting reasons for that. Some of them are just the dimensioning of them. Some of them is the fact that they haven't been renewed or invested in a long time. But the bottom line is we're now at this stage where we're starting to see the effects of these tail events. This morning I woke up reading about Catania in eastern Sicily, which is under a significant amount of water. And that's a prime example of how this manifests itself. And of course, one of the challenges here is because we've lived for 100 years with the illusion that those tails had been managed away, it's not a continuous change. We're suddenly waking up to a very significant shift in water security, in the experience of water security. That's partly our own doing. We eluded ourselves that we had separated ourselves from it. And so that poses a whole set of interesting questions that I'm hoping that today or in the future there'll be a chance to talk with many of you. I have three themes in my head, but there'll be others, and I hope in the discussion we can sort of go through them. The first is actually maybe boring, but I find it fascinating, which is the methodological issues that this poses. If I think of public health angles, and there's a long history of epidemiology. I think of and this has intersected the world of water. I think, for example, of the famous cholera research lab of the 1970s in Bangladesh as an example where the world of water and public health sort of intersected. But it's fair to say that the efficacy of water management interventions is not evaluated with the same rigor, with the same epidemiological rigor that is applied to the health space. And this didn't quite matter when the population of instances where we failed was so rare, particularly in developed countries. Of course, the story is different in developing countries. But now we're going to have an increasing population of failures, and I think it begs the question of what the statistical behavior of these are and what the efficacy of our interventions actually is, and how do you actually reliably measure efficacy. So there's an interesting kind of question of what can the water sector learn at the intersection of health and public health. I think for some time, the WASH world has been integrated. Waterborne diseases have always been at the forefront of public health. But the broader question of how do you manage water resources for public health outcomes when you're also talking about, as was mentioned earlier, death or other sort of broader infrastructural issues, it hasn't been really addressed. So that's a big theme to me. The second big theme is the design of the infrastructure that we will need to deliver higher degrees of water security in this new uncertain world with greater and fatter tails, and maybe with time-moving tails, right? Maybe the new we're actually no longer stationary. That's the point, and I think Miles, you teach us this well. And so then the design of infrastructure, we've gotten so used to one way of solving this problem of cutting off the tails and delivering security that we've sort of forgotten that we have a great diversity of options in front of us. Today, you go to Japan, you go to California, you come to London, you pretty much have the same water experience, no matter where you are. That hasn't been the case throughout history, and partly because people in different places took greater advantage of what was regionally peculiar, which was typically the hydrology and the ecology and the landscape. So this question of how you integrate, broader definitions of infrastructure in delivering better health outcomes is really quite interesting to me. There's a movement in the environmental space from which I come to integrate ecosystem and ecosystem services. I have to confess that they are sort of fuzzily defined and often poorly, their performance is poorly evaluated. But if we're serious about using nature, as it were, to deliver water security in any meaningful and manageable way, we have to do a much, much better job of understanding what the real impact of managing a watershed is, for example. I'm reminded this is not impossible. There are 5 big cities in the United States that have an avoidance filtration determination That is, they can avoid primary and secondary treatment in water delivery because they invest in forested landscapes that do the job for them. So even in highly regulated sectors like water supply, clean water supply for cities, this is possible. But there's no systematic framing for this question of how do you measure the performance of broader definitions of infrastructure in the delivery of water security, as defined in terms of people's experience and therefore also people's health. So that's a second sort of big topic: is what does the infrastructure of the future actually look like when you have to manage these fatter tails? And then the third and last area, which I have a particular interest in, is the question of institutional design. We build things to manage water, but in the end, the way we manage water is through rules and organizational infrastructure. And when you enter a world in which crisis management is much more present, and when the exercise of executive power is greater, it begs a whole bunch of questions about how you manage, how you design institutions for that. When you transition from sort of crisis management to just the management of variability, which is something that we sort of somewhat forgotten to do in water, so much so that, as I said this morning, people in Catania were mightily surprised by the fact that the city is underwater, even though it may have been a predictable, not a predictable event, but an expectable event. And there, the range is enormous, and part of the challenge that we have is figuring out what the taxonomy of these questions are. In water, of course, there are issues of allocation. In Australia, people have dealt with greater variability by creating water markets. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. But if you use public health as an analogy, public health of the last 200 years has gone through enormous amounts of judicial review, for example, in order to come up with the rules by which we live together and allocate resources in order to make choices about public health, and also, decide where and when we can exercise power over people, something we've seen in the pandemic. So that, to me, is the third really interesting question: is in a world of fatter tails where stationarity is no longer true, water security switches to a different definition. That includes its effect on health. What does the institutional arrangement and policy regime look like to manage that transition and manage this new normal? So those are three topics, Nevin, that I find interesting. I'm sure that people will surprise me with many others in the discussion, and I look forward to talking to everybody.
Thank you, Julia, for these excellent opening remarks. I think, unfortunately, we have no connection with Professor Michael Keith, which is rather unfortunate. But however, we have to, take advantage of the event as much as we can. So I think at this stage, we should switch to the breakout rooms, and participants are free to move around the breakout rooms. I will be in a room of Professor Michael Keith. If somebody wants to talk about urbanization and climate-related migration aspects that are becoming more and more acute in a present world. But please, I think we don't have to do anything technically, Joe, right? We will be pulled to the area where we can select which room to join, right?
Yes, absolutely. This session will close, and then you can click on which table you'd like to go to. These overviews have been really fascinating, and they sound like quite separate topics, actually, but I think there might be some common themes which would be interesting to discuss when we come together at the end. Just want to say that there are clearly some strong experts here, but not everyone's an expert. So don't feel worried about coming to a room where you don't know a lot about that topic, but you want to learn a bit or discuss it or ask questions. So do come along and join a discussion room. Don't feel shy, and we'll see you there shortly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.